We're just waiting for the stream. Okay, great.
Oh, there we go.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 18 of Fast Casual, London's official podcast, brought to you live today. Well, not necessarily live. Uh, Tuesday, December 5th, from two places today, from Baltimore, Maryland, and New York City. My name is Alex Mann, and I'm your host again, and it's great to be back after a 1 week break. As I like to say, every restaurant has a story, and so without further delay, let's get this show on the road. I'm delighted to say that I have Julie East, the VP of Talent and HR at the Atlas Restaurant Group. Julie, say hi.
Hello.
And do you want to give us a bit of an introduction into who you are? I mean, anyone who does a quick little LinkedIn search will see that you have an extremely impressive background in human resources and talent, having spent a number of years in various leadership positions across a number of different industries and organizations. Do you want to add some color to that?
Yeah, well, I guess first of all, that says that I'm pretty full of sage wisdom because I've been around for so long. But I've been in HR for about 30 years and started in retail with Gap Inc. in San Francisco. Had a really great career there. Loved the culture, loved Gap. Decided to move on to another industry. So I actually was in the supermarket industry for several years as the head of HR for a family restaurant group, and really enjoyed the idea of working with a family, a family and business together. And after a few years, decided to go back to big corporate. So found myself at Amazon and learned a lot while I was there.
I can imagine.
That family feel, the family environment. So when I launched my job search for where I landed for this job, the fact that Atlas Restaurant Group is still at its heart a family business really attracted me, as well as the idea of the potential growth, which has completely panned out. When I joined the restaurant group 4.5 years ago, we had only 8 restaurants, and now we have 30 restaurants. So
Yeah.
it's very fast. And especially when you consider the pandemic was in there and we were completely shut down for several months during that time. So really love my time here at Atlas. It's great to be in the hospitality industry and able to influence things here from a people and culture standpoint.
That's unreal. And you know what's an interesting fact that it just dawned on me as you were talking is that why Landed even exists in the first place is because Vivian used to work in private equity, the CEO, Vivian Wang. And one of her main clients was Gap in San Francisco.
Really?
And she was working on projects to solve their hourly worker hiring strategy. And that was the sort of overarching genesis for her kind of taking the leap of faith and coming in and setting up a company like this.
That's
So
great.
that is something I did not tie together until you said that. So fun fact, fun little fact. I guess, it's interesting having had so many years in across so many different industries as well, because, I always believe that there's very much like a truth for some rather than for all when it comes to sort of like culture and organizations, in the sense that like different cultures, different companies, organizations might have different flavors of what they see as like a great culture. But fundamentally, there are sort of like, it's hard to describe, but when you see it, kind of elements to it. And I'm curious, jumping off there, when you think about, like culture as like a kind of high level thing, and you think about, say, like Atlas, for example, if we just dive straight in there, think about that as like a sort of a great place for hospitality workers. What I'm always very curious about is, to your point, when you joined, there were 4 restaurants, and now you're like, like north of 30. That like scaling culture is not the same as like scaling process. And so I'm curious, like what, like how you think about scaling that culture so that there's this sort of like uniform acceptance of like what the actual culture about this restaurant is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I like to think about culture as a beautiful swan swimming across a beautiful, serene lake. So everything looks great on the outside, but underneath in the water, that swan has some very powerful legs that are propelling it forward. And so if you liken that to culture, culture doesn't just happen. Culture needs to be created and intentionally created by the leaders of the company to really show, what it is that they want for an employee experience. And so Atlas in its heart, as I mentioned, is a family business. And one of the things that has helped us to retain that family feel is that the owners of our company are very actively involved in being in the restaurants. And, here in Baltimore in the Harbor East neighborhood, we have, about 6 restaurants, and they are frequently in the restaurants in the evening, dining, greeting guests. The restaurants that are outside of Baltimore, they make a very strong effort to get to them very frequently, including the ones that are in Philadelphia and in Houston and in Florida. So they are like tremendous culture carriers as they are out and about. And, the operations, the operators also are held to that same standard in terms of being mindful of the culture that they're creating based on how they treat employees. And so all of that has to be very intentional and very clear cut, set as an expectation for our leadership team whether they're coming in from the outside or they're being promoted from within.
Yeah, that's like super fascinating, because I think like one of the things I hear a lot from a lot of your peers is that, there was such an exodus of sort of talent from the hospitality space in particular during COVID. And that sort of like managerial class, where people who are ready to be promoted or people who are ready to move into more executive positions from being GMs kind of left. And now there's almost this kind of like, I don't want to say a dearth, because it's probably like too strong a word, but there seems to be like almost like a sort of like a managerial gap for a lot of hospitality organizations, and trying to find those diamonds within sort of the existing sort of employee stack, so to speak. And it's like, how do you think about like isolating those diamonds and getting them ready for promotions and getting them ready for kind of moving into more executive sort of positions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not really sure what a dearth is, but thank you for using that fancy word.
Or like a lack. Sorry. I'm way too
I've never
pretentious.
heard that before.
Clearly.
But interestingly, during the pandemic, we were able to retain our tier 1 level leaders, which was amazing that Alex, the owner, was able to do that. And
that's amazing.
So we didn't really see a lot of turnover in the management levels. Where we saw the extreme exodus was from the hourly front of house staff.
Yeah.
And we've yet to fully recover from that. And I think, stating the obvious here, for anybody who's in hospitality knows that was a big, big fright for people who had made hospitality their career. And during that time that we were all closed, they had to really look, kind of soul search, and decided that, many of them decided that hospitality wasn't going to be a place they were going to come back to.
Yeah.
And then for everybody who might have been interested in becoming a bartender or a server, they also questioned, even before jumping into the industry, do I really want to go into that industry? So, and so far as our, I think things are really coming back from a hiring standpoint. But, you're right about the observation that external hiring for leaders is really a challenge. And so it only makes sense that we've put a lot of time and effort into developing an internal pipeline from hourly to salaried. We are implementing some programmatic processes to make sure that it is fair. The selection process is fair, and the experience of getting ready to become leader, like practicing some of those skills before you're actually promoted, is, it's a really good strategy, because then it's not the deer in the headlights when somebody does get promoted. Totally. And now they're telling their peers what to do, and that is never a comfortable situation. And we're lucky that we can move promotions from within to other properties so that they don't have to learn those lessons in front of their peers. But I think, again, promoting from within is the name of the game. It is the only way to build your restaurant with capacity, because those individuals who you promote already understand the culture. They're already bought in, and they are more loyal. And so the highest level of turnover we see at the management level would be people that we've hired from the outside who just never were really able to acclimate to the culture here. And quite frankly, I would consider that to be good turnover.
Well, exactly that. I mean, and it's interesting because I think it engenders a type of like liferism. I find like, this, like as I was saying earlier, like this is episode number 18 of this format of the podcast, and I think I've done 20 others now for for other style of podcast, or shorter one. And it's interesting in the sense that like, you know, an observation that I see as a sort of relative outsider in the space, in the sense I don't technically work in like hospitality, I'm going to hear these stories, is that you know the kind of more successful scaled groups, chains, franchises, hotels, whatever you want to call it, they have a high degree of like lifers within the organization itself. And I was talking to actually Dave and Buster's yesterday, the head of operational excellence there. And we were chatting and we were saying this exact thing where it's like, there isn't necessarily like a patent on like entertainment and restaurants. You know what I mean? Anyone can copy effectively what they're doing. It's like, but why are they able to have hundreds of locations? Like they manage like 200 locations, 150 of the actual brand, and then another 50 of a separate brand they bought. But like, it's the culture within it, and the way he was talking about like their majority of their executive teams there and the staff that are there in sort of managerial positions have been there for a long time. And I hear this again and again and again from a lot of people. And I guess when you life into a successful brand, it's like the people are the brand within hospitality. And I'm sure you'd probably like agree with that.
I do agree with that. I also would say to you that sometimes the lifers can be the biggest impediment to really bringing the culture change. And I'll say that goes for front of house and back of house. I mean, back of house, the days of the chef being able to scream and yell and fire people on the spot are over.
Yeah.
And we do not tolerate that here at Atlas Restaurant Group, because that's not the culture we're creating. And
Totally.
some chefs cannot adjust their behavior. They're just running on sheer emotion, and eventually those people don't work here anymore. Same for front of house. The my way or the highway thought process and mentality of old is not working for this generation, and really for any generation. I mean, it doesn't really matter what age you are. You want to be treated with respect. You want to know that you matter, right? You want to know that your efforts are contributing to the larger success of something, and something really great. And again, I think that's what we are able to offer here. And I'm sure that talking to Dave and Buster's or any number of other restaurant groups, I'm sure that is a big point of desire for them as well.
Totally. I mean, at the end of the day, you're all in a sort of quasi battle for talent anyway. Like, as in, you're all trying to find that staff that you want, like your top of funnel staff. You want to find quality people you can bring in that you can groom into leadership positions, and environments like The Bear on TV, or environments like, I've been listening to Kitchen Confidential, the Anthony Bourdain book, on an audiobook over the last week, and I'm like, what a harrowing experience it was for him.
I know. I read that book when I first joined Atlas. Somebody recommended, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad we're not doing this anymore.
Totally. And I think, I was talking to somebody recently, and they were talking about like COVID being a great reset for their business. And, I guess, those types of cultures, those kind of that historical, or that sort of like that kind of pervasive sort of kind of perception of restaurants is like crazy chefs and, real kind of, crazy kitchens, and just the environment being kind of rather toxic. I think definitely from leaders and peers like yourself, like people who are in kind of groups that have multiple locations and are looking to scale those locations, that's just environment cannot exist anymore. It's just like there's no way you could hire people to come in such a competitive environment for employees and allow or enable an environment like that, because just the turnover, just the working environment, and the choice that a lot of workers have now to kind of go find other places is just like too extreme to like put up with that sort of behavior.
100%. Yeah. I mean, in fine dining, which the majority of our restaurants are fine dining, servers, bartenders, support staff, they can make a lot of money because of the service level, the price point, all of that. But they can do that anywhere, and so what is it that sets us apart? What makes us the employer of choice? And, it's all the things that we talked about before, but there's to take the conversation in a slightly different direction, the other reason why our employees why we retain
Yeah.
employees is because the quality of the food. It is, absolutely no sacrifices whatsoever. And
Yeah.
in talking to employees, I've had this come up in multiple roundtables. Reason people stay is because, number one, they can stand behind the food that we sell, and number two, that if there is anything wrong from a guest standpoint, it's going to be handled in a very professional way, and the guest is going to leave satisfied. So that, again, you don't find that in a lot of places anymore. And it's like the customer's expectations, the guests' expectations are getting higher, while in some places it's getting more difficult to provide that type of attention and hospitality for people who are dining out and spending a lot of money.
Totally. I hear that a lot from people, especially from like the actual operations folks who are like knee deep in the running of the restaurant, that
Mhm.
the expectation of it's almost the expectation is grown even more since COVID, and that like restaurants, hospitality groups have had to like try and keep up or innovate their processes to stay on top of that, given that there's a sort of systemic lack of people within the industry at the moment, that they have to make up for that, because obviously more people you have in the restaurant, you can cover a lot of holes. So more people are doing, like less people are doing more to manage a greater level of expectation. It's funny, I talk to a lot of hotels and resorts, and they see that very much like in particular, because like not just like the restaurant experience, like if they've got a hotel experience, they've got like late check-in experience. There's so many like little boxes to tick. And again, I think a lot of those resorts have a lot of those problems as well, because they're also like struggling to hire very specific kinds of people to do very specific jobs for them. Like very
Mhm.
hard to find a night manager, for example, and that like you get a bad experience in a late check-in, for example, that's what you remember. And I was talking to somebody recently, and they were telling me they were with Craveworthy brands, and she was saying to me that like people will remember, people kind of remember like a good experience, like that's what they expect. They expect a good experience, but they absolutely will remember that bad experience. And
Mhm.
so to be on top of that, like very fine line, from a people perspective, basically like says to me as a sort of like observer that you need to have like great people running with great processes, like almost having the process to greenhouse the great experience.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. We can find out that the guest isn't satisfied from social media before they even get their bill, right? That's how
Yes.
immediate it is these days. And, guests are getting more picky. And again, they have a right to a great experience when they go out, but it is true what you're saying, that it comes down to that frontline employee who is
Yeah.
servicing, who has a service mindset, who's humble and hungry and wants to be, creating this amazing experience for people. And that that characteristic, if we were to test for that, right? We don't do this, but if we were, running our hourly staff through some sort of assessment before they were able to join, we would see empathy really high on that list, right? It's empathy that gives the ability to think of what the guest's experience is like, to walk a moment in their shoes, and then in order to, in doing that, then to provide the kind of experience that they themselves would want.
You're the first person who's said the word empathy to describe that sort of great hourly worker, that
Mhm.
kind of, and I say that because again, I spoke with the director of hotel operations at Amman, which is those five-star resorts, and he was like, he's French, so we were kind of laughing, and he was like, we're like, how would you describe it? And I said to him, I was like, is it like a certain je ne sais quoi, And it's like, the French have that phrase, and he was like, yeah, like you can teach service to people, like you can show them the restaurant and you can work them around, but what is the thing that elevates them to be a great front of house? And I actually think, to your point, I think like the word empathy has not been a word that I've actually heard like articulated. Like I guess people are feeling that it's empathy, but are people struggling to describe what that is? And it's like, how do you test for empathy when
Right.
you're under so much pressure to get staff in the first place? Do you
Uh,
guys have like a formal process for that, or do you just think about that as a sort of holistic, this is the kind of person that we want?
well, Both yes and, I should say. Yes, we do think about that a lot. We sometimes have to bring in a person we might not be sure about, but for the most part we're looking for that ability to be empathetic. And there's interview questions that I like to ask, such as, what have you learned about yourself lately? Right? That demonstrates somebody's ability to, if they can articulate that they are a learner, that they
Yeah.
are humble. They're willing to see the world in color as opposed to just black and white. And that's a
Yeah.
really important skill to be able to have as a hospitality provider for people who are coming into a fine dining establishment and expect to spend a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that is, and also training our leaders on how to interview from a behavioral interviewing standpoint. And I'm not sure if you
Yeah.
know what we mean by that, but it simply means asking the questions to elicit examples of what they have done,
Yeah.
not what would you do in this situation. And that gives
Like
us
a tell me about the time kind of question.
yes, that gives us
Yeah.
a better chance of understanding if they have actually had the experiences that we would be, hoping that they would bring to the table as an employee of Atlas.
Totally. And I guess it sounds to me like you have a very formal process for like developing leadership amongst your employee base there, because to even think and articulate these kinds of questions, I've not really heard people speak to these before. So it sounds to me like you've really got your process down. It sounds to me like you've done a great job, Julie.
Well,
Oh,
let's just say that some of what we're talking about is on the docket for 2024.
yes.
We've made some great progress in the last couple of years, but there's always room for improvement. And for example, we are going to be launching a hospitality focused learning experience. I won't call it training. It's going to be a learning experience, very hands-on. We're going to start with our tier 1 leaders, that top level of front of house leadership. And within those sessions, the majority of them are going to be focused on hospitality and truly fine tuning what the expectation is. But then one of the modules is going to be on selections. How do you select somebody who is going to be a match for your culture and a match for your environment? And using, that style of behavioral interviewing, because we do believe that is going to get us the best result. So, all of those things are either in place or becoming, a priority for the next year.
You know what's interesting about that, and I think about that a lot in the sense that because you're a very fine dining group, focused group, so you need more experienced front of house that have been in those kinds of environments before. I'm curious how you think about the sort of, I don't like using the word acquisition of people because that's like the wrong word to use it, but the sourcing of talent, so to speak. You're in the Baltimore, Maryland metro area and you're kind of spread out over there. So you're a big city right next to you. But like when you think about like trying to zero in on that kind of talent, does that kind of put you under pressure to kind of get going as well, in the sense that you're like, not only do you need to find people, you need to find people of a certain quality and background experience to like elevate the brand? Does that put a lot of pressure on your GMs and put a lot of pressure on you?
Yes, it does put pressure. And we are we have a seasonal dining pattern. So all of our restaurants are patio based, or I should say patio. We have a patio focus. So when the weather gets like it is now here in the US, in the Baltimore area anyway, there's that we're not dining outside anymore, right? So the space becomes a little bit smaller, and we do have a category of seasonal hires that we can then lay off people for the season that we're not as busy. But I would say to you that and I've heard this echoed throughout our operators, that we would much rather hire someone who has the interpersonal skills and the empathy, like we talked about, and the customer or guest service mindset, and train them on the steps of service, right?
Yeah.
You can learn those. I would much rather hire somebody like that than somebody who thinks they know it all and has had a lot of great fine dining experience, but is not a learner. They don't have that learner mindset. They're not good for the team unless they are super willing to share that experience. But unfortunately, there have been, times when a person like that comes in and can really cause an unhealthy level of competition
Yeah.
instead of the team competition that we strive for.
That's interesting. And I actually hear that a lot. I guess you're not unique amongst your peers in the sense that there are, especially for the fine dining restaurants, groups, hotels, kind of the five-star hotels, the resorts, that the premium that they're willing to pay is to find the right person who has that sort of empathy, that sort of, the je ne sais quoi, as we're saying, where they can just get the right person in and then they can train them the service versus the other way around. I feel like, it's almost like, I don't know, has fine dining staff kind of given themselves a bit of a bad name in the sense for like moving around? Is that the inverse of what we're learning?
I mean, I guess you have to look at the establishment and the culture from which
Yeah.
they grew those skills, right? That certain types of restaurants want that air of sophistication and that air that we are very, I don't know, I guess maybe rigid in the service requirements. And
Yeah.
there's not a lot of fun or laughter that goes along with that. And in our company, we want to see a balance there, because
Yeah.
you want people to be able to come to work, managers and employees, to have fun and to enjoy the time that they're here. That always creates a much more engaged guest experience, right? And
Totally.
there's something I learned a long time ago, and this was actually from the supermarket industry, and that is the least engaged employee on your team is going to equal to the most engaged guest or customer that you have. So if you look at that least engaged employee on your team and expect that that's going to be what the guests are experiencing, then how do we get everybody level set to the level of engagement we need in order for them to provide a great experience?
Yeah, it's interesting. So you say what's the phrase I'm looking for? But you are the weakest link in your chain. Is that kind of what, you're only as strong as the weakest link? Is that the kind of?
Yeah, that is kind of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, like I was saying earlier, like one bad experience is what people definitely remember.
Yeah.
But like when they go, it's like, yeah, I'll remember that. And you hope that they remember it forever. But like in the sense that if people are, that you expect good service when you go out and you pay and you go to fine dining. So to have a very negative one or to have a slightly negative one is something that will be remembered. And it's interesting just in terms of like net detractors and net promoters and how, like to your point, like people will complain even before the check is signed. Like they will go on social. So that's like the kind of pressure that like everyone's under. I guess when I think about like say pressure, then you think about like the sort of emerging trends, and we spoke about like Anthony Bourdain and the Bear and these kind of very crazy environments, and we think about like pressure that the staff are under, given that there's just less staff now. There's a greater expectation from like people like going to restaurants. Like what sort of trends are you kind of seeing in terms of like what people who come into the restaurant are kind of looking for in terms of like the working environment, given that there is a expectation of pressure, and given that there's kind of less people than there are greater customer needs?
I would say, I'm not big on the generational differences. When people were talking so much about millennials, I thought, if I was a millennial, I'd be really sick and tired of being stereotyped the way they are, right? I will say that we have, on the younger end of staff in a lot of our restaurants, and I feel like they are reflective in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, all of those things are reflective of the guest that is coming into our restaurant, and in fact, our city here in Baltimore. And I think that is a really positive thing. And I think the way that we are, like the trends that we're seeing with people coming in who are more on the young end, it's a very situation where they're looking for experiences, right? It's less almost about the money and more about the loyalty that they feel, that they feel resonate with our vision and mission here at Atlas Restaurant Group. And I would also say that they expect more. Right? They expect more out of their managers, and they expect more from the entire benefit package, right? They want to know up front, like, what is the medical, what is their dental, is their vision,
Yeah.
So we try really hard to stay on top of trends, make sure that we are offering the very best that we can for our employees, and including, the requisite employee discount for any of our restaurants. That's a really positive
Yeah.
thing. And we also offer, and we've done this for a long time, we have a mental health benefit. And
Yeah.
I am so glad that we had put that in place before the pandemic, because we were
Oh,
able
yeah.
to have people, even though they were laid off, they could still avail themselves of that type of service. And it's been, on the increase ever since we've come back, based on, what's happening in the world today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's a lot because what I hear from you and from peers is like, it's not necessarily about the dollar salary. People can leave for $20 to $24, but like,
Right.
what is the sort of like, the culture benefits and the actual culture itself that goes behind it that makes it a great place to work and a great place to stay. And it sounds to me like, I think you're kind of on the same page that like it's like, how do you compete on the benefits as much as like on the dollar amount that they're getting in their paycheck?
Mm-hmm.
Seems as a great, like in a way to keep people like in the group itself.
Yeah.
Like that's part of the formal reason why you run that sort of program. I guess like what I'm getting at is that like lots of groups, hotels, resorts, everything across the board are all still, I think there's a kind of feeling it in the dark kind of way,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, how do we like land upon a strategy for retention that doesn't just have a prerequisite of like how much money are we paying, as
Oh,
if
right.
like
Yeah.
salary is like table stakes, and then it's like
Mm-hmm.
people are still trying to figure out what are those kinds of strategies,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is interesting to me 2 years after COVID has kind of ended, when there's kind of seems to be a kind of a what's the word I'm looking for, where there seems to be like a kind of convergence on sort of ideology around benefits and pay for a lot of the best have converging on really good strategy for this. Like they've like nailing a strategy for. Whereas I still feel like I hear people not know how to nail this part right. But it sounds to me like you kind of have that down.
I think one of the big contributors to retention is letting people know where they stand. People really do want to know where they stand. They want to get feedback. They want to know when they did something great. They want the recognition. And then if there is a course correction needed, they want their manager to talk to them about it immediately, right? They want that feedback to be able to improve. And I find that if we have a particular restaurant where maybe the manager is not skilled at giving feedback in a way that people can receive, that does impact loyalty and engagement. And I think that's such an interesting connection, but it is true. I mean, people want to know where they stand at any given
Okay.
time.
And I think that's actually, it's very much and you're saying we don't really talk about generations per se, but
Mhm.
it definitely seems to be something that I've observed just in the job I do today, and then also just in general, that there seems to be a greater demand for communication, which stems into kind of constructive feedback. Like, I guess what I'm getting at is like that sort of Gen Z cohort, much more even than say like that quote unquote millennial cohort, are looking for more modern ways of communicating, which like
Yes.
want to text over an email. Like they're not going to check any email, it seems, and they won't for a text. But I guess that they're also brought up in a hyper candid sort of environment, that there's no like faking it till you make it in that sort of cohort, or that sort
Yeah.
of, I'm speaking very broadly here,
Yeah.
but with that is like, this constant desire for feedback and validation. And so what I've heard from a lot of other restaurant operators and HR leaders is that, how do we design a system to give them the feedback? Like how do we put in place the sort of parameters that they're feeling like they're within the workplace, that they are learning how to improve. Again, it sounds like you've kind of got that done. I feel like every talking point I have, you've got a great answer for, in the sense
Sorry.
that it's like,
Well,
sounds like, yes, like apologize for my success.
I think that I mean, I will speak, on our behalf. We
Yeah.
are challenged with finding, like, we have a pretty robust human resources system that we can use for tracking feedback, right? Because part of giving feedback is tracking it so that the leader who is going to write that performance evaluation at the end of the year can actually remember, right, all the good things that person did, and maybe some of the areas of opportunity from that person. right? And if they don't write it down or put it in a system somewhere, it just gets blown away in the wind. And so the leader doing that evaluation only remembers really the last 3 to 4 weeks. So the person
Totally. And you're at
rated, but they're
the
only getting rated on the last 3 to 4 weeks, which is not really effective. So, there some HRIS systems are a little bit clunky. Honestly, they're not as mobile friendly as we would like for them to be. So we're sort of getting there, but I can't say that we've really hit the jackpot yet in terms of tracking feedback well.
yeah.
That really is a ongoing challenge that we have.
I think, you're not alone. A, as an industry, or B, as a company. I mean, every tech company that I've worked for that you think would be all over this kind of stuff has never really had anything better than Google Sheets. And by I will sort of like answer all these questions and do them all in the same day kind of thing.
Right.
I think, designing that process for really great feedback is a struggle for lots and lots of great organizations. And I think, like there's a fine balance, and it's so hard to figure out what that is. I mean, if you think about like how Google have designed their sort of programs and their leveling programs that they have, I mean, I think a lot of their staff will probably say that they're overburdened with, employee feedback and employee sort of like they're constantly in a kind of process of giving feedback that they're kind of like overdoing it. But like,
Yeah.
it's interesting to think that like there's a fine balance, but like there's definitely on the inverse that like, yeah, you need to get a process in place first and foremost so that people are not getting feedback on the day that it's been written, which has that sort of like recency bias, which is no good for anybody. And I guess, one of the things that like I'd love to know on that, when it's like we're talking about a lot about like retention of employees and really kind of trying to figure out how to like engender better performance out of these employees. I guess when it comes to like, roadblocks for like making that happen, is this like in your sort of number one, sort of like how do we like identify like performance improvements and start from there? Or are there other kind of larger issues generally that come with the retention of sort of like hospitality staff that spring to mind for you, rather?
Yeah. Well, I think the other, I hope I didn't make it sound like our leadership pipeline is a panacea. There's always room for improvement, and there's also always room for more teaching, more education, more experiential learning for a leader to be able to operate with a high degree of emotional intelligence in terms of how they manage their team, how they build a team, how they address individual issues and questions, that sort of thing. And so I think a big area that we are going to be growing in terms of leadership development in the coming year is going to be around the concept of emotional intelligence. It sort of goes hand in hand with the growth mindset, leadership who can view people as unfinished works who are capable of growing and changing, and leaders who are self-aware of their own emotions and able to manage themselves in a situation where emotions are high. Those are the type of leaders who are the most successful. They're still able, I should say, they're still focused on operations and running a successful operation, but what really takes them to that next level are those skills that demonstrate that emotional intelligence and the growth mindset.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that goes back to kind of almost like we were talking at the beginning about like, that sort of those je ne sais quoi kind of empathy kind of indicators for leadership. And I guess, like I said, it's hard to describe, but when you see it, and I'm always like curious, like these sort of intangible indicators that you're really looking for, because like I said, I mean, if you've one restaurant and you say 40 staff that are there, it's like how many within that have that? And then say you got 30 restaurants, so is that 1,200 or something?
Yeah.
So it's like, and then within that 1,200 people, it's like, okay, how do I find those people? Because it's also quite a wide net now. So like, how do you, as they like, is it like almost like a hierarchical, like this is, you need to say like to your, who are they? I don't know, who reports up to you? Like the operators of the restaurants themselves, or like how does the feedback find its way to you, if that makes sense? And you're the one running the program for.
Well, somebody on my team is, but like the internet kind of messed up there. Could you just state the question one more time so I can make sure I'm hearing you?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, because these are quite intangible kind of features when you're looking
Mhm.
across such a wide net of people. Like, talking, I would imagine north of 1,000 people. So with that, like, how does that, with this sort of intangible elements that make up like really high potential leadership opportunities, how does that information kind of almost get filtered up to say to you to say like we have found these people and this is why these people fit these
Mhm.
opportunities? Is there like, well, I'm very curious how that works.
Yeah, so I think there's two things that really play an impact in that realm. One is, doing a regular engagement pulse check, right? So we have started that practice of doing regular engagement surveys, and of course, one of those or one section on that survey asks questions about my manager, right?
Yeah.
And employees are not afraid to speak their mind in that regard. There's the questions where they have to select like a strongly disagree to strongly agree, and then there's a place for them to write comments. So from the employee standpoint, that's a big, important, very important window into a leader's ability to be that high potential. Um, and but the second thing is an HR practice that I am really a big believer in, and that's talent review and succession planning, right? So, outside of the regular annual performance evaluation, to step into a room as an executive team, to evaluate our tier one leaders on not only their performance, but also their potential to get to next. Is this a person that we can rely on to go and run our next restaurant in the city where they're not going to have quite the oversight that they do in Baltimore?
Yeah.
So that's a very important discipline and rigor. And again, we are not perfect at that by any stretch, but it does fuel then that succession planning, which is really where you put on paper exactly, okay, what would we do if this person left? Let's go
Yeah.
into the role. What would we do if this person left? Is this person ready to become a director based
Yeah.
on the results that they're having? So those conversations that occur during a talent review are really, really important. And when we have, our corporate chef who sees a lot, right? When he's in restaurants in the back of house, he's constantly communicating with the front of house. Our operations leaders, our HR,
Yeah.
being there, representing how those leaders handle employee issues when there is a problem. All of that gives a lot of insight into a manager's ability to be that leader that we need them to be.
That's awesome. And that's actually so helpful. I love how I think that's probably the best thing you said was the very last thing that we can say on this episode. That was amazing. What a high note to leave that on. Thanks so much for coming on, Julie.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to just click the end button, so just stay on the line.
Sure.
It's not going to. Okay, one sec.